Racial discrimination and oppression after the Mexican-American War. In this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the relations between Mexican-Americans in California and Texas with Anglo-Americans as they start to populate the region after the Mexican-American War. For Californios, you're going to see a dramatic change, especially for the elite Californios who owned large ranchos in the state. At the end of the Mexican-American War, there was a treaty that was signed called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and in this treaty, the Mexican-Americans were given the option of U.S. citizenship, and their land rights and property rights were to be respected. And the U.S. signed this treaty. But in many ways, the property rights of Californios were not respected. In 1851, the state of California passed a law known as the California Land Act, which required all Californios and Mexican Americans to prove that they had title to their land. They needed to prove in court that they had legal title to their land. And this pretty much encouraged Anglo-Americans to squat on the land of Mexican Americans, because at that point, if you're a Californio and you haven't gone to court to prove that you have legal title to your land, or if you're in the legal system and it's taking time to process through the system, at that point you don't have legal rights to that land. And so squatters could just come and start setting up shop on your land, building a home and living there, because at that point nobody has rights to that land because you haven't legally proven that you have title to the land in court yet. And so that encouraged the squatters to start taking over Mexican American land. And the whole court process was very difficult for Mexican Americans at this time. Part of the reason that it was such a problem is because the cost involved, especially if you lived far away from where the courts were located, which were mostly in San Francisco. So if you from Southern California, you have to pay expenses to travel up to San Francisco to go to the court. You have to pay lawyer fees, court fees, and all that could be very taxing. Another issue is that the courts themselves could be corrupt. The judges could be paid off or bribed. Politics were influenced by the increasing numbers of Anglo-Americans who were moving into California, and many of them squatting on Mexican-American land. And also, the legal cases were held in English, not Spanish, which was also a great disadvantage to Mexican-Americans who couldn't speak English at that time. They would have to depend on their lawyers to represent them. And of course, the legal fees really hurt them financially. Overall, because of the California Land Act, a lot of Californios ended up losing their land because of court fees and lawyer fees. They ended up having to sell their land in order to pay for these fees, even if they won the court case, right? Many did win the court cases, some did not. But even if you won, after going through that whole experience, you're in debt now, and you have to sell off your land in order to pay for your fees, so you end up losing your land one way or the other. Another way that Californios lost land during this time period was through interracial marriages. How did that work? Well, basically you would have Anglo-Americans marrying the daughters of elite Californios who owned large ranches, and eventually through inheritance they would gain the rights to that land, especially because in American culture at that time, once a woman is married to a man, the man gains complete right over all of property that the couple owns. The woman loses her legal identity and the man represents the couple. So once Anglo-American men married into these California families, they gained the rights to that land and property. It was much quicker in some cases than going through the whole legal process of stripping the Californios of their land. And lastly, another way that the Californios lost their land early on in California statehood was through natural disasters. In the 1860s, there was 2 years of drought, not a lot of rainfall, and during that time, a lot of the cattle that was owned by the large ranchos died off. You couple that with the rising prices of cattle, and a lot of the ranchos simply went out of business. They had to mortgage their properties and eventually had to sell their properties. And so through all of these events, you see the Californios losing a lot of the land that they once owned in the state of California. The state of California also passed other laws that discriminated against Mexican Americans, such as the Civil Practice Act of 1850. Now, the Civil Practice Act was originally targeting Native Americans and the Chinese, who were also in California at the time. Basically, this law made it to where Native Americans and Chinese people could not testify against white people in court. This law was also extended to include Mexican Americans. So if you had, say, a white family moving onto your land, you couldn't even sue them. Or if you were attacked by a white vigilante group or anyone who was Anglo-American, you could not testify against them in court, right? And so the legal system was pretty much working against Mexican Americans at that time. You also have the Greaser Act of 1855 that was passed, and this designated Mexican Americans as vagrants. A vagrant is pretty much somebody who is unemployed, doesn't have a job, or is homeless. So a Mexican American could be jailed and forced to do hard labor during that jail sentence, which could be up to 90 days, simply because they're designated as being a vagrant. Actually, within the law, they state that vagrants, the definition of a vagrant can include greasers, right, which is a negative term for Mexican Americans at this time. And greaser, they define as somebody who has Spanish and Indian blood, right? So definitely designating Mexican Americans with this law, claiming that they are vagrants just simply because of their race. And then they could be jailed and then forced to do hard labor. Right, so more examples of the legal system in the state of California oppressing Mexican Americans. And you have the California Gold Rush as well. With the California Gold Rush, you had a large amount of immigrants from many different countries coming to California to participate in the gold rush. So you have immigrants coming from Latin America, different parts of Latin America, right, such as Chile, and also Mexico as well, where you have a lot of experienced miners, especially in the area of Chihuahua, coming to California to take advantage of the gold rush. You also have individuals from Europe, such as French miners coming, Australia as well. So you have a large amount of immigrants coming to California because of the gold rush. Then this sets off a sentiment of xenophobia amongst the Anglo-Americans who are afraid that all of these foreigners will take all of the gold before they even get a chance to mine it themselves, because you have large amounts of immigrants, right, coming in the thousands, coming to California. And many of these immigrants were impoverished people, and the way that they were able to come to California was they were employees of a business owner in their own country who paid these impoverished people to come and work as miners in California to take advantage of the gold rush. And so Anglo-Americans were also afraid that these impoverished people from these other countries would end up staying after the gold rush and becoming part of the population of California. Of course, there's racial prejudice involved in this as well, especially with immigrants that are coming from Latin America. Okay, and so Anglo-Americans were trying to figure out a way to deal with all these foreign immigrants that were participating in the gold rush. And in the state Congress, you have a state senator by the name of Thomas Jefferson Green who comes up with an idea of how to deal with all these foreign miners. And so he basically comes up with this idea for the foreign miners tax. The foreign miners tax basically was a $20 a month tax on all foreign miners. Okay, they all have to pay $20 a month to the state in order to work in the state. Now, Green comes up with this idea because, one, he's trying to raise state revenue, and he figures that the state will make $200,000 a month, and at that time that's a lot of money, off of the foreign miners tax. But not only is he trying to increase state revenue, but he's also trying to give a source of labor to Anglo-Americans, because since this tax is so high, many of these impoverished immigrants cannot pay it. Then Americans could pay the foreign miners tax for them and employ them at a fairly cheap rate. And so that was the idea behind the foreign miners tax. But there was actually some resistance to this tax. Many of the foreign miners refused to pay $20 a month. They would be okay with paying lower prices, like maybe $4 or $5 a month, but 20 was just too much. And so you had some resistance to this tax early on, but through force, California sent troops in to enforce the tax. Many of the miners were either forced to pay it, or if they couldn't pay it, they were kicked out of the area of the mines. And so in that way, the foreign miners tax did get rid of some foreign miners from participating in the mining, but it didn't bring in ultimately as much money as Green had expected that it would. Okay, so ultimately the foreign miners tax was a failure because instead of bringing in $2 million a year, it ended up only bringing in around $30,000 a year. Not everybody paid it, and ultimately the tax was repealed because it didn't bring in as much revenue as was expected, and it also caused conflict as many foreign miners resisted paying the tax in the first place. So now let's go over to Texas and we'll take a look at some of the interracial conflict that is going on there. Many of the Anglo-American immigrants who came to the South came from the frontier parts of the Southeast. So we're talking about the areas where you have the modern day states of Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. In this area, it was like a frontier at this time in the United States. These weren't well-developed areas yet. And so basically you have some plantations, cotton plantations, some small farmers, impoverished frontiersmen, and basically they brought their racial prejudice from that area, that frontier area in the Southeast, with them to Texas. A lot of their experience with dark-skinned people was with Native Americans in the Southeast, who they looked down upon, as well as enslaved African Americans, who they also looked down upon and had racial prejudice against. So when these immigrants arrive from the United States, from the Southeast into Texas, they bring this racial prejudice with them and apply it to Mexican Americans in Texas. Now, the bulk of the Mexican-American population, or Tejano population, in Texas was in the southern part of the state. So if you look here at this map, you can see like the areas of like San Antonio, Goliad, Victoria. These are the main centers of the Tejano population at this time. It's mostly in the southern part of Texas. But eventually Anglo-Americans will start to migrate into that region as well. And they will begin to harass the Tejano population. In many cases, they're doing so to try to gain control of their land. And after a period of time of harassment and physical attacks and violence, many of the Tejanos in those areas ended up migrating. So they were forced out of their homes and migrating into areas of Mexico. Many migrated into northern Mexico, not too far away. Not all of the Tejano population migrated at that time. There's still a significant amount because they were the dominant population in those areas, but hundreds did migrate because of the violence and harassment coming from Anglo-Americans who began to flood the southern part of Texas. Now, besides physical harassment and intimidation, another way that Tejanos lost their land in Texas was Anglo-Americans used their knowledge of the legal system in that area to pretty much force Mexican-Americans out of their land. They also used political connections as they began to gain more and more prominence in the region in order to pass laws that worked against Mexican-Americans. And you also seen interracial marriage taking place in Texas as well. well, just as we saw in California, where Anglo-Americans would marry into the families of upper-class Tejanos who owned large ranches in order to gain control of that property. Part of the violence that took place in southern Texas was an incident known as the Cart War of 1857. Now, in Texas, there was a lot of ranches, right? The ranching industry was perhaps the biggest industry going on in Texas at that time. Now, these ranches or ranchos or rancherias, they produced items that would be shipped out on the coast of Texas, and from there would go to a number of different destinations. And it was a very lucrative business. Now, the thing is, though, you had to get these products from the ranches in southern Texas to the coast. And so there was a need for transportation. Now, the transportation of ranch goods was primarily conducted by Tejanos, right? They monopolized that business, right? And Anglo-Americans had wanted to get involved in this transportation business, or the carting industry, because it was $1 million industry. There's a lot of money to be made in transporting ranch goods from the areas of like San Antonio to the coast, right? And so Anglo-Americans tried to get involved in the industry. They tried to compete with the Tejanos, but they couldn't do it. Why? Because the Tejanos charged much lower prices, and the Anglo-Americans were not able to penetrate into that industry. So, frustrated that they couldn't get involved in this $1 million industry, Anglo-Americans ended up using violence, intimidation, harassment, breaking the carts, damaging the carts of Tejanos, stealing their merchandise, physically violating them, even killing some cartmen. All of these attacks on the cartmen and their carts and their merchandise eventually allowed Anglo-Americans to get involved in this transportation business, and eventually Tejanos lost their monopoly over that transportation industry. Now, the cart war is not the only example of violence against Tejanos in Texas. You also have what are called vigilance committees being developed. A vigilance committee is not a legal law enforcement organization. It's just people from a community who organize themselves to protect themselves against any threats. And so vigilance committees started to spring up in some of these areas in Texas where Anglo-Americans were experiencing theft. Maybe there were Mexican cattle thieves who were preying on them and their ranches. So eventually they formed these vigilance committees to try to protect themselves. But the problem is a lot of these vigilante groups targeted Tejanos who were not even involved in stealing cattle, right? And so an example of this would be the case of Juan Moya. Juan Moya basically was accused of a murder and captured by a vigilante group and was executed. Him and his two sons were executed. There was no legal process. He didn't go to court, didn't go to trial, nothing like that at all. He was simply captured. There were some guns found on him, and it was assumed that he committed these murders, and so he was immediately executed by this vigilante group, only to find out later that Juan Moya was not actually responsible for those killings. The actual killers were later captured, and Moya and his two sons were pretty much murdered for no reason. And so this is just an example of Tejanos experiencing violence because of these vigilante committees, simply because they were Mexican American, right, and were falsely accused of crimes that they did not commit. Part of the reason why this happens is because there was a lack of law enforcement in some of these areas. Also, if there was law enforcement, sometimes they would just look away when these vigilante groups were committing these crimes, right? These vigilante groups were never punished for committing crimes against Mexican Americans, right, and performing this illegal law enforcement. And finally, we'll end with looking at stereotypes of Tejanos in Texas. There were a number of different stereotypes that were applied to them. Some were racial stereotypes simply because of the way that they looked or their skin color. Anglo-Americans would compare them to African Americans using derogatory terminology. They would also compare them to Indians or Native Americans because some Tejanos looked more Native American. And so there would be a lot of racial discrimination going on Tejanos simply because of the way that they looked or their skin color. There were stereotypes about the intelligence of Tejanos. Anglo-Americans would say that they had a childlike mentality, denigrating them in that way, that they were lazy, that they didn't want to work, that they were sexually immoral, or that they were just simply pleasure seekers, that all they wanted to do was dance and gamble, have a good time, or take a siesta, take a nap. Basically, all these stereotypes were trying to imply that the Tejanos were not hard workers or that they were not industrious like the Anglo-Americans. But in the meanwhile, you have Anglo-Americans doing their best to take their land or take over their ranching industry or taking over the transportation industry that they were involved in. So on one hand, you have Anglo-Americans actually using violence against the Tejanos to take their industries away from them, and then on the other hand, you have this prejudice or stereotypes that are saying that Tejanos are lazy or that they don't want to work. So ultimately, in both California and Texas, you see discrimination taking place against Mexican Americans. You see the legal system being used to take away land from Mexican Americans, and you also see illegal violence being perpetrated by Anglo-Americans against Mexican Americans. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me and I will get back to you.